Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 325. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, August the 12th, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. The topic of today's podcast, the topic of today's essay is cheap and expensive. So you're thinking to yourself, okay, Strong, how can something be cheap and expensive? Well, I guess in some ways, in some worlds, in some instances, it can be. But basically, what I want to talk about in today's podcast is how some things that used to be very cheap are about to get more expensive. I'm not going to say super expensive, cost more. How's that? And the reason why a lot of things are costing more. And by the way, it's not always a bad thing because everything is relative. We're going to talk about expensive things getting cheaper. About cheaper things getting more expensive. However, expensive is relative. It just depends on what you have and what you can spend your money on and how much money you have to spend it on. And just everything being relative and the art of compromise, whereas we don't always have to have everything always at our beck and call. Because when you make that decision, to make the decision of saying, you know what, I want unlimited stuff now. Dear listeners, that's when things get expensive, okay? So we're going to go into that on today's podcast. And the main drivers of that is a story that I picked up, one domestic and one very international. Before we get that, an update on last week's podcast. I like to go ahead and leave everything on the table and have an open book per se. There was one thing that was going on last Saturday when I did my podcast that I did not share with you, dear listeners, but that's because I didn't know about it. I did the podcast last Saturday on our trip up the Danube River, our trophy wife and my 40th wedding anniversary trip. And we talked about that part of Europe and the cool things about it and the history and the architecture and the people and the food and the beer and the wine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I talked about a lot of things, but one thing I did not mention, and that's because I didn't know about it. We brought a souvenir back with us. COVID-19. That's right. Actually, when we woke up last Friday morning, before we came home, we went to bed about 10, 11 o'clock and then got up at 5 in the morning. So, you don't sleep, at least I don't sleep real well before I have to do something big the next day. And traveling halfway across the world is a big deal, especially when you're not in control of how you're going to get from point A to point B. The cruise company did that, and they did a good job. But for me, there's a bit of anxiety. So I didn't sleep that great. We got up, we did our thing, and we're on the plane, and we stayed up close to 24 hours before we got home early Friday evening. And we were tired, of course, and a little bit of a hoarseness in our throat, okay? More of a dry throat than anything. But then, you know what? You're spending all that time on an airplane where the humidity is very low. You're tired. You're worn out. What the heck? That's part of the deal. Go to bed, get up Saturday morning. I felt a little foggy, but then there's the jet lag instance there, and the throat's still a little not sore, but just you could tell something's there. I did the podcast. Don't know if you could hear anything in my voice. And listening back on it, I didn't hear anything in my voice, and I felt fine. The trophy wife, not so much. So she tested for COVID-19, and she tested positive. So of course, I tested for COVID-19. And I tested positive. So it's quarantine time. So for the next 5 days, we stayed at home. A few days after that, we went ahead and went to work, but went to work in a mask, stayed away from people, etc. I will mention this again. I mentioned this back in December when I had COVID. Friends, if you get COVID and feel bad, talk to your doctor. have your doctor prescribe Paxlovid. Friends, that stuff is wonderful. The trophy wife, again, she was feeling pretty bad, took that stuff, and within about 24 hours was feeling pretty doggone good. It was the same way with me. Just a note on this whole COVID-19 thing. And I love to say, see, I told you so. Not because I'm a pompous ass, even though I kind of am, but quite often, if you listen to what the logical people say, the non-extremists, the non-bomb throwers, the people with a level head, if you listen to that, generally that's the truth. And it was a whole thing with this COVID-19 thing, in my opinion. You had two schools of thought. You had three schools of thought, actually. You had the Dr. Fauci school of thought, where if you left your house without a mask, you were probably going to die. Then there was the whole other end of the spectrum, how it was all made up by the government just in a way to ruin the economy and let the Chinese run the world. Both of those were just, if you believe both of those, I'm sorry for you, because you're, no offense, but you were just a fool. The truth of the matter is actually what the CDC said from the beginning, and actually what the WHO said from the beginning. And had they kept with that and shut up and not just expanded on this thing and doubled up and tripled up and quadrupled up, I think we would have been fine. Remember way back when, what did they say about COVID-19? What did they say about this whole coronavirus? Look, this is a pandemic. It's a big deal. Let's just try to, remember the term, flatten the curve, because that's going to give us time to take care. When the people really get sick, they can go to a hospital. We can care for them. And by the way, give us some time. We're going to come up with some type of a drug that's going to make this thing not a big deal. Well, 2.5, 3 years later, they've come up with this Paxlovid. And friends, when you get this thing and you take Paxlovid, it's no big deal. You feel bad for 24 hours. That's it. So the original doctrine of the CDC and the WHO was, look, be careful, stay away from people, don't spread this thing, give us some time to figure out what it's all about and find some, not so much of a cure, because you're not going to have a cure for a virus, but a way to make sure that you don't get too terribly sick and die, okay? We're there now. There still is coronavirus out there. I'm proof positive. I got it, okay? But between my vaccinations and plus I got it back in December, this time around, I mean, I only took Tylenol a couple of times. That's it. I didn't feel bad. I still stayed away from people because I didn't feel bad doesn't mean the next guy's not going to feel bad. My 87-year-old father, I stayed away from him because if he gets it, it could be a death sentence for someone like him. But the bottom line is, it's not a big deal now. It's not made up. And it's not going to kill 8 billion people in the world either. It's something in between. The art of compromise. Speaking of compromise, on today, Saturday, August the 12th, in the St. Louis metropolitan area, East Central Missouri is where I live, just west of St. Louis, actually. And we had a big storm last night. And it was a big deal. Not so much rain, but some thunder, lots of wind. And, of course, the trophy wife is having a pool party today. So the goal was to get up, do the podcast, go to the shop, work a few hours on the Jaguar, come back, host the pool party with my wife's friends. Well, 3 hours of cleaning up the mess kind of put the kibosh on working on the Jaguar. But that's okay. And when I say compromise, two things come into play. First of all, I really wanted to work on this car on Saturday, but I'm married. It's a partnership. And as part of the compromise, I couldn't say, look, I know you're having a party, but I'm working on the car. You're on your own. And her friends would have shown up to a pool full of leaves and a yard full of sticks. Okay. Couldn't have that. So I fixed it all up. It looks great now. Took about 3 hours, but that, in fact, the vacuum, the robot vacuum is still running for the second time. But the numbers are good. The pool looks great. I'm going to take all the crap out of there. All the leaves and sticks and twigs have been picked up. And I just won't work on the car. That's all. Okay. That's compromise number one. And when you're married, of course, you compromise. All of you that have a successful marriage know that's necessary. Many of you that have unsuccessful marriages, maybe you should have known that it was necessary, okay? Compromise number two. Did you hear what I did? Cleaned up the sticks and the twigs and the leaves from the pool in the yard. Friends, I have no trees in my yard. Why did I have to pick up leaves and twigs and sticks and acorns and everything else? I don't have trees. My neighbors have trees. Isn't that their responsibility? Well, I spend a lot of time picking up leaves and twigs and branches and acorns out of my yard, out of my pool, okay? And I don't complain about it, even though I don't have a tree. By the way, I spend a lot of time picking up dog crap out of my yard, and I don't have a dog. Now, why do I bring this up? I'm piggybacking on the whole coronavirus thing. It's called compromise. If you're going to live in a community with people, you compromise. Just because you don't have a dog doesn't mean you're not going to have to clean up somebody else's dog crap. Maybe you had an irresponsible person walking their dog. Maybe the dog escaped or they weren't paying attention. Who knows? But for whatever reason, you clean up dog crap in your yard because a lot of people have dogs. Even though I don't have dogs, I clean up dog crap. Even though I don't have trees, I pick up leaves and sticks and twigs and acorns. That's part of living in a community. If you don't like it, buy yourself 100 acres in the middle of nowhere and you're not going to have to worry about that. In the meantime, if you live in a community with people, you need to be tolerant of those people. Are we done? I think so. Let's go on with the topic for today's podcast. Cheap and inexpensive. There was a strike going on, or almost a strike going on. Remember UPS? They were going to strike at the end of the month. That was in September, I think. And they didn't. They reached a compromise. And the UPS drivers now, a lot of people say, why, the amount of money they're getting paid, it's astronomical. Actually, it is. But I don't think it's a bad thing. Because if you've ever seen UPS drivers work, friends, they hustle. They work hard. They really do. And I don't mean just working hard like, well, they have to get up early and they have to work late and they have to shift gears in a truck. No, these guys get up and they run with these boxes to their destinations. There's never a minute. When our UPS driver comes at the company in which I work, I'll talk to him occasionally. He doesn't stop and sit down and talk to me. He's filling out paperwork while he's talking to me. He never stops. He never misses a lick. The new UPS driver and benefits package, do you know how much the UPS driver with seniority is going to be earning under this new package? $170,000 a year. That's with benefits. But I have it $170,000 a year. And you don't need a college degree for this, friends. Actually, the UPS driver who used to deliver to my employers, he had a master's degree in education. I said, what are you driving a UPS truck for? He laughed. He said, I can't make this kind of money teaching school. So he has a master's degree and drives a UPS truck. But the UPS shipping giant, they actually warned that profits will be lower than planned because, in part, reflecting the pay increases agreed to grant U.S. workers for the labor deal last month, they're going to have to put out more money than they thought they were. So they're not saying they're not going to make money. They're going to say they're just going to make not quite as much. Reason being, because they're paying their people more. Is that a bad thing? They used to make $145,000 a year. Now they're making $170,000. So that's a $25,000 a year pay increase. Do you think that's too much? Do you think that's ridiculous? You think somebody driving a brown truck should be paid that much? Here's what I say. If you say yes, here's what I ask, a question I ask of you. If you really think a UPS driver is paid too much money, and I'm guessing because you're looking at the amount of money you get paid, thinking, well, I don't make that kind of money. Psst. Here's what you can do. Quit your job and work for UPS. It's kind of that easy. If you think a UPS driver makes more money than you and you think you should earn that kind of money, apply for a job for UPS. They're hiring, friends. Yeah, they're hiring $170,000 a year, and they will hire you. Okay? That's a big deal. And UPS is still making plenty of money, just not as much as they'd like. Oh, well, that's okay. Their people get a little bit more. How is that bad? Now, we've had a rising cost of living. It's strained household budgets. Labor tensions have boiled over, leading to unionization campaigns at Starbucks and other companies and strikes throughout the country. In fact, the threat of the strike by the Teamsters Union hit UPS recently when customers diverted about 1 million packages per day to rival companies. Now, that cost the company $200 million in sales, okay? In a call to update investors on Tuesday, UPS said the deal reached by the Teamsters, expected to be approved by workers later this month, would also weigh on its profits. It now expects an adjusted operating margin this year to be 11.8%. That's down from 12.8% they expected in May. So their profits are going to be down 1%. That's not a big deal, okay? So this whole UPS thing, yeah, these guys make too much money. I don't know that they do, okay? The company's still making dough. These guys are making a great living. They work hard, and why not? In fact, here's the deal. The agreement reached by the Teamsters last month raised the starting pay for part-time staff to $21 an hour. That's part-time, okay? Now, for drivers, the Teamsters Union, which represents more than 300,000 UPS staff, said the new contract would provide a pay boost of $250 an hour this year and $750 an hour over the 5-year deal. So you get a good raise. The average hourly pay in the U.S., $34 in July, while the average compensation cost for employers in the U.S. was about $43 an hour this spring. That's total compensation. About 2/3 of the cost went towards salaries, while the other third represented benefits. So there you have it. UPS is going to start paying their drivers a ton of dough. $170,000 a year with benefits. Friends, that's a lot of dough. But again, if you think that they're getting paid too much, apply for a job at UPS. Now, what will happen? You think UPS is just going to say, yeah, we're just going to suck it up and not make as much money next year? Nope, they'll raise their rates, so things are going to cost more. Now, what does that mean for you? Maybe you don't shop on Amazon anymore. Maybe you go back to Walmart or Target or Macy's or wherever you used to shop because prices got too high. It's all supply and demand. People are still shipping stuff like crazy. So apparently, and the company's making money, and the public is paying the price for UPS charges. Translation, $170,000 is not too much, and their price is not too expensive, because if it were, they'd be losing a ton of business and making no money, and they're not. That's the expensive part of expensive and cheap. The other part is there's cheap goods everywhere. And when did the cheap goods start? Well, there's always been cheap goods. Back around 200 years ago is when cheap goods really started to show their ugly head in the civilized world. Prices in Europe and industry in Europe began to plummet because there was a new kid in town, the United States of America. And the efficiencies, the cheap labor relatively, the low energy costs relatively, the resources that were available to them, lots of coal, lots of iron, lots of fill in the blank, were just putting the people on the continent out of business because of cheap labor. So the U.S. was the original Asia, okay, in the industrial world. Fast forward to let's just say 2020, maybe 1990, okay? And the cheap Chinese stuff started coming in big time. Now, before then, there was always Taiwan and Hong Kong, okay? To a lesser extent, Japan and Korea, or Malaysia, or someplace like that. But China, there wasn't a ton exported from China because they were a closed society, a communist society that we really didn't do much business with. Well, they exploded. And they started flooding the market with cheap stuff. And everybody in the United States was saying, oh my gosh, they're stealing our labor. They're doing this. They're doing that. And I was never concerned about that. For the last 30 years, I've not been on the radio that long, but even just talking amongst my circle of friends, for the last 30 years, I've said, look, that's the way it is today. When these Chinese decide they're not going to work for $200 a month, things are going to change. Well, friends, that worm has turned. In fact, the era of ultra cheap stuff for us, it's under a threat. In fact, I'm going to say it's on its way out. Factories across Asia are struggling to attract young people, which is bad news for Western consumers accustomed to inexpensive goods. So, does this ring a bell? Even Asians, young people that are Asians, they're having trouble working in factories. They don't want to do that. Nobody wants to work anymore. These darn young people. Well, that applies to Asians too. In fact, a workplace features floor-to-ceiling windows. Here's a workplace we're talking about. It features floor-to-ceiling windows, a cafe serving matcha tea, as well as free yoga and dance lessons. In fact, every month, workers gather as team-building sessions to drink beer, drive go-karts, and go bowling, all on the company dime. Is this Tesla? Is this Google? Nope. It's a garment factory in Vietnam. Yeah, they're having to do that for their employees because they're having trouble attracting young people to work in factories, not just in China, but in Vietnam, in the developing Asia countries where lots and lots of cheap goods come from. Now, Asia is the factory floor and source of much of the stuff that Americans buy, the cheap stuff, but it's running into a big problem. It's young people, kind of like here, by and large, just don't want to work in factories. Now, that's why the garment factory that we talked about earlier is trying to make its manufacturing floor more enticing. And it should raise an alarm bell with Western companies who rely on the region's inexpensive labor to churn out affordable consumer goods. In other words, if they've got to do all this stuff, have go-karts and bowling and drinking beer and free yoga classes, that to attract people, that raises the cost of their product. Now, the twilight of ultra-cheap Asian factory labor is emerging as the latest test of the globalized manufacturing model, which over the past 3 decades has delivered a vast array of inexpensive goods produced for consumers all around the world. Americans became accustomed to bargain rate fashions, flat screen TVs, and there soon may be a day of reckoning with higher prices. According to Paul Norris, he's a British co-founder of the Vietnam garment factory called Unavailable. He says, there's nowhere left on the planet that's going to be able to give you what you want. Now, his factory Unavailable is based in Ho Chi Minh City. It used to be called Saigon. People are going to have to change their consumer habits, and so are the brands. Now, workers in their 20s, the garment industry's traditional labor force, routinely drop out of his company's training program, Norris says. Those who often work just a couple of years and they quit. Norris hopes that dialing up the workplace's cool quotient will make the difference. Everybody wants to be an Instagrammer or a photographer or a stylist or work in a coffee shop. Sound familiar? In response to the crisis, Asian factories have had to increase wages and adopt some sometimes costly strategies to retain workers, from improving cafeteria fare to building kindergartens for their workers' children. Toy and game maker Hasbro this year said that labor shortages in Vietnam and China have pushed up cost. Barbie maker Mattel, which has a large production base in Asia, is also grappling with higher labor costs. Both companies have raised prices of their products. Nike, who makes most of their shoes in Asia, flagged in June that its production costs had gone up because of higher labor expenses. Now, for consumers that have been used to having goods at a certain relatively stable part of their disposable income, I think that the foundation is going to have to be rejiggered. That's according to Manji Pradhan. He's a London-based economist and co-author of The Great Demographic Reversal. Now, starting in 1990, China and then other Asian manufacturing hubs integrated into the global economy, turning nations of poor farmers into manufacturing powerhouses. Durable goods such as refrigerators, sofas, they became less expensive. Now, those manufacturing nations are running up against a general problem, and that is that young workers, they're better educated than their parents, and they're veterans of Instagram and TikTok and other social media that are saying their work life shouldn't unfold inside factory walls. Now, young people in Asia are having fewer children than their parents did as well, and at later ages, which means they're under less pressure to earn a steady income in their 20s because they don't have to. Again, sound familiar? Why don't people work in this country, younger people? Because they don't have to. A booming services sector offers the opinion of less grueling work as store clerks in malls and receptionists in hotels. Easier work, pays almost as much, they don't need the extra money. Now, the problem is acute in China, where urban youth unemployment hit 21% in June, even though factories have labor shortages. Sound familiar? Multinational companies have been moving production from China to nations including Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and India. Factory owners there say, too, they're having trouble getting young people to work. So it's not a Chinese problem. It's a problem in Malaysia and Indonesia and India and Vietnam, all over Asia, okay? Factory wages in Vietnam have more than doubled since 2011. They now make a whopping $320 a month. Now, that's 3 times the rate of increase in the U.S., but it's still $320 a month. But it's doubled since 2011, okay? Now, wages rose 122% from 2012 to 2021, the latest period for which UN data is available. Earlier this year, Nguyen An Tung, he's a 21-year-old Vietnamese high school graduate, he quit his job as a mechanic at a suburban Hanoi auto parts factory to work as a motorbike driver for Grab. Grab is kind of like the Vietnamese Uber, okay? He ferries passengers to and fro, less money than he earned at the factory, but he said it's worth it because he's now his own boss. He doesn't have to work as hard. Nguyen said that many supervisors often made very unpleasant remarks, which stressed me out. He said the heck with it. He said factory work would tempt him again, but only if his old monthly salary of $400 a month, if that doubled to $800, then he would go back. $800 a month? You're starting to approach what some folks in this country earn, okay? And you're not there, but you're close, okay? You're in the ballpark. How's that? Now, in the past, manufacturers might simply move to less expensive destinations, but that's not so easy nowadays because there are other places you can move where cheap labor is still there and very plentiful. Africa, South Asia, okay, have huge labor pools like Ceylon and Bangladesh. But these places have another problem that China and Vietnam and Malaysia don't have. They're politically unstable, or they don't have a good infrastructure, or they don't have a trained workforce. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you open a factory and the government has a coup d'etat, you can't do business there anymore. Lack of good infrastructure. If the grid goes down and you don't have electric power feeding into your factory, you can't make parts. A trained workforce, you think, well, how? It's monkey work. How putting a square peg into a square hole, how is that hard? That's still a skill that has to be learned, okay? And if you have a populace who doesn't understand the language and doesn't understand simple instructions, you got to remember, in some African countries, I did some research on the country of Benin, okay? And the reason I did that is because I bought a bunch of nuts, and the number 2 sourced country for these nuts was the country of Benin. I don't know anything about Benin. Benin is a very agricultural rich country in Western Africa. It's a small country. And I started reading about the ethnicity of Benin. And I'm thinking, well, okay, they're all Africans, right? Well, they all are Africans, kind of, but Africa's a continent, not a country. There's like 45 different ethnic groups who speak 45 different languages. And most of them, very few of them, read and write. In fact, some of their native languages don't have a written alphabet. So if you got a guy who can't speak the language and can't read, even if he could, it didn't matter because his language doesn't have an alphabet. His language is not written. How do you teach this person to do a task? How do you explain to him that he needs to show up at 7 o'clock in the morning? How do you explain to him that he sits at this table, not that table? It's really hard. And they're having a problem. In fact, clothing brands were stung when they expanded into Myanmar and Ethiopia. Okay, here's cheap labor, but then they had a problem. Both countries had a civil war, and everything had to be closed down. Bangladesh has been a reliable base for making clothes, but really they're clogged ports because they don't have much infrastructure there. They can't ship stuff out, okay? And the political people are just, well, okay, you got to grease a bunch of palms to get your stuff done. So it's not really cheap anymore, okay? I still remember years ago, I was doing business with a company, a machine builder in Lebanon, and they bought some stuff. They liked it, and they had a big project going on where they were building some machinery, and they needed to buy some of the larger, more integral parts from us. We quoted them. They said, look, we were going to place this order sometime in the next month or so because we need to do a machine build, and we need to get this to the customer by such and such a date. Can you meet our time frame? We said yes. Nothing. Dead silence. I never heard from them. I called, I emailed, I left messages. I could not get a hold of these people at all. Finally, about 18 months later, I called and I talked to the guy. I said, hey, what happened with this whole deal? He said, the whole thing went south. I said, why? He said, well, we had some problems. I said, well, what were the problems? He said, we live in Lebanon. We have civil war sometimes. Our factory was bombed and we had to rebuild it. Friends, if you have to rebuild your factory, that's something we never consider in this country. Well, what if we have a coup d'etat and don't even start talking about January 6th and Donald Trump? I'm not listening to that, okay? There's no chance of a coup d'etat in this country. We're not going to have a revolution in this country. It's not going to happen. In fact, I've told the story before. Miami, I think the numbers dwindled down, but once upon a time, not too long ago, Miami was home to 3 different manufacturers of wet wipes and feminine care products and baby diapers in the city of Miami. Now, nobody makes these products in a city. They make them out in the middle of nowhere. But they were small factories, and you think, well, why did they do that? It was simple. Because these countries, that their parent company was from South America, 2 out of 3 from Venezuela. And they thought, look, we got to have a safety valve because it's not a matter of if there's a coup d'etat and the government changes. It's when there's a coup d'etat and the government changes. We've got to have a reliable place to manufacture. And you know what? They never have coup d'etats in the United States of America, so they built a factory here. Christina Chen. She's a Taiwanese owner of a furniture company that sells to American retailers like Lowe's. And she decided to move her factory out of China 4 years ago, hoping it would be easier to recruit someplace else. So first she considered the industrial zones near Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, used to be Saigon. But then she heard nightmarish stories about high worker turnover and soaring wages. So instead she set up in rural northern Vietnam. Now her floor workers are typically in their 40s and 50s, and some can't read, okay? So in other words, she has to tell these people verbally the task, use visual instructions to have her get the jobs done. But you know what? These people stay and they work. She does treasure her younger employees who can read, and she involves them in decision-making, invites them to meet her American buyers when they visit, and shares pictures with them of the company's tables and chairs in the U.S. stores. Her company is called Acadia Woodcraft Vietnam, and it's partially automated, but human craftsmanship is still necessary for many of the tasks. So she's gotten a workaround, but that workaround was move to a different country in a very rural part of this country that has no infrastructure or factories. That, my friends, is a huge risk. Let's go back to Nike. In 2021, Nike reported that more than 80% of its factory workers were in Asia, and that the typical one was 22 years old, single, and raised on a farm. So they came to the big city to make big money. Today, the average Nike worker age in China is 40. In Vietnam, it's 31, in part because Asian countries are rapidly aging. Remember what's happening in Vietnam in China, to a bigger extent, China. Having kids is expensive. And in the case of China, the government said you can only have one, okay? Having kids is expensive. But then when you stop having kids, 20 years later, oops, there's no 20-year-olds. And it's not like you can buy more. The best thing you can do is start making kids. But who has kids? It's 20-year-olds. And even if they start having more kids, there's less of them to have. So it's once you start, it's hard to start back up. Another company called Maximum Limited Vietnam. They're a Nike supplier founded back in 1995. They've seen competitions for workers intensify as well. They now have big skylights that beam natural light through windows at their factories. They've planted thousands of plants and trees inside. They've ramped up training for young people and let the young people become supervisors. It's kind of worked. But again, it becomes expensive. And you get to the point where, okay, if I can make this shoe in Asia for $10 and it costs $40 to make it in the U.S., we make an extra $30 a shoe. Because remember, I've said this before, we don't manufacture in this country because we can't make money. It's just that the profit margin is much bigger if you make it in Asia. We can move virtually all of our manufacturing from Asia to this country, and the companies would still make a profit. It's just that they'd make $5 for every $100 sold instead of $75 for every $100 sold. So it's not that they can't make money, they can't make as much. But the window is narrowing. When it used to be 70% profit versus 5. Through automation, that 5 has turned into 10. And because of high labor, that 70 has turned down to 40. So the window is narrowing. What is the magic number to bring stuff back here? We may already be there because manufacturing in this country is on the upswing. And it's not because of cheap labor. It's because of automation. There's a factory in France. Okay, I know this isn't the U.S., but France is a Western country. They now make shoes in France instead of Asia. Their labor cost in Asia was like, I don't know, it was like $28 an hour. Their labor cost in France was like $103 an hour. But they moved it all to France. Well, how could they do that? Easy. Everything is automated. They required 400 employees in their Asian factory. In their French factory, they needed 18. Okay, if you take a 0 away from the amount of employees that are required to make product, you can add a 0 to the number that they earn, and your profits are there. So, are cheap goods on their way out? Maybe. There's always a way around it. And it's going to affect you, dear listener, if you're saying, why, I have 75 pairs of shoes in my closet. I like to shop on Amazon, and I buy 10 pairs of shoes at a time. And of those 10 pairs of shoes, I may just keep 2 of them and send the other 8 back. They'll take them back. What the heck? Here's where that's going to change. First of all, those shoes aren't going to be $40 a piece anymore. They're going to be $50 or $60 or $70 a piece. As far as the charges go, remember, UPS drivers now make $175,000 or $170,000 a year, or they will when this contract is ratified. That's going to make that shipping a whole lot more expensive too. Translation, they're not going to let you buy 10 pair and return 2 of them at no charge. Or if they do, that $40 pair of shoes is going to start costing $60. So you're going to be out $600 and then return them. And you may say, you know what? That's changed. So that's how things are going to be different. We can't have 100 pairs of shoes. We can't have 75 shirts. We can't have 8.5 million toys in the kids' toy box. But you know what? We're just fine if we have 5 pairs of shoes or 10 shirts, or instead of 8.5 million, maybe just 1 million toys in the kids' toy box. Then things aren't expensive anymore because you're just buying less. It's a need versus want. What do we really need versus what do we want? Because some of the want is going to have to go by the wayside. Same with compromise. Remember, we talked about that at the beginning of the essay. Compromise solves everything. And here's the compromise. If stuff costs more, you got two choices. You can make more money, you can save less money, or just buy less of the stuff. Is there anybody out there who can look in their shoe cabinet or their shoe box or their closet and think, you know what? I don't have enough clothes. Everybody's got enough clothes, okay? Everybody does. Everybody's got enough toys. Everybody's got enough fill in the blank. We certainly eat enough, okay? Look down at your belt if you could see it. We certainly eat enough. That's why entitled today's essay is Cheap and Expensive. Because the costs are going up everywhere for everything. This cheap Katie bar the door mentality that we've been used to is probably going to be going the way of the dodo in the very near future, if it already hasn't happened now. Well, that's it. We're done. JamesStrongShow@hotmail.com. That's the email address. Do you like the podcast? I hope you do. If you're listening, I guess you do, okay? You've been listening for 41 minutes, and if you don't like it, if you've been doing something for 41 minutes that you don't like, I don't understand that. So thank you for listening. Thank you for the feedback. I get email every week, and thank you, dear listeners, for the emails. I enjoy reading them, and I do respond to each and every one of them. Maybe not with a manifesto, but at least with a few words, and I thank you for that. Pass the podcast on to others. Post it on Facebook, email it to a friend, do what you want. I appreciate all the feedback I get. That's it. I'm done. Till next time, this is James Strong saying adios.